Hi, I'm Andy Temte, and welcome to the Saturday Morning Muse. Start your weekend with musings that are designed to support your journey of personal and professional continuous improvement and to improve financial literacy around the world. Today is March the 15th, 2025. Over the last few weeks, we've been exploring the relationship between price, value, and decision-making. And last week, we made the recommendation to engage in self-talk, to challenge preconceived notions and biases that impact our day-to-day spending and investing habits. We also reviewed a short list of subconscious biases, which are also known as cognitive biases, that included confirmation bias, decision fatigue, the disposition effect, the messenger effect, loss aversion, optimism bias, and the sunk cost fallacy. As we continue our journey to build financial literacy skills, you may be wondering where all the formulas and all the numbers are. Well, this is a big misconception of financial literacy, that it is more about the numbers than it is about the behaviors. How we feel about money and investing, and how we behave with the resources we have via the decisions we make are as or more important than our ability to work with numbers. Hence, this is where we're going to place most of our initial emphasis. While behavioral finance and economics are not new ideas, their mainstream adoption as integral components of practical and academic finance and economics is. Looking back through the long lens of time, the 18th century economist and philosopher Adam Smith, yes, Adam Smith, the invisible hand guy, alluded to the impact that feelings and behaviors had on markets and asset prices. However, it wasn't until the very late 1970s and 80s that behavioral economics and finance began to be taken seriously in academic circles. There won't be a quiz, but Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, and Richard Thaler are household names in academia. Kahneman won the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work in the field, and Thaler is also a Nobel Prize winner. When I was a finance graduate student in the PhD program at the University of Iowa in the early 1990s, behavioral finance concepts were still very new and were subject to criticism by more quantitatively oriented academic thought leaders. The thinking was that market participants were quote-unquote rational, and that asset prices were a function of standard supply and demand forces and could be modeled by discounting future cash flows to the present and other statistical processes. I can't tell you how many academic studies I read where the assumption of quote-unquote market rationality was noted in the first few paragraphs. I know we haven't talked about discounting and supply and demand yet, which are essential financial and economic concepts that we'll cover in an appropriate amount of detail in future episodes, but the point I'm trying to make is that behavioral finance and economics are fairly new and are finally being taken seriously by academicians, business leaders, and investors. People are finally starting to recognize that markets are not rational. To see just how mainstream these concepts have become, I recommend that you pick up Kahneman's book, Thinking, Fast and Slow, from 2013. So let's get back to the cognitive biases that affect our economic and financial decision-making. Richard Thaler co-authored the book Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness back in 2008 with Cass Sunstein. This quote from that book sums up the need to understand the biases that lurk inside our brains. Here's the quote. People often make poor choices and look back at them with bafflement. We do this because as human beings, we are all susceptible to a wide array of routine biases that can lead to an equally wide array of embarrassing blunders in education, personal finance, healthcare, mortgages and credit cards, happiness, and even the planet itself. End quote. Since understanding cognitive bias is so important to financial literacy, let's close out today's muse with a few more biases that are in the must have a basic understanding of category. The first is anchoring bias. Anchoring bias can be thought of by the more common phrase, jumping to conclusions. In anchoring bias, you place tremendous weight in your decision-making process on the first piece of information you receive and put less weight on subsequent information you gather. That first piece of information is known as the anchor. Now, next is herd mentality. Not herd like listen, but herd like a herd of buffaloes. Herd mentality is where you follow the crowd instead of making an independent, data-driven decision. Herd behavior is prevalent in all sorts of buying and selling situations. If an influencer or messenger, remember the messenger effect from last week, says buy, then many people will buy whatever is being recommended without engaging in independent critical thinking. This is happening in the cryptocurrency world in spades. Next is overconfidence bias. Overconfidence bias is related to optimism bias that we discussed last week. Overconfidence bias is where you overestimate your own ability to reach a decision and you end up ignoring or minimizing expert advice. Overconfidence doesn't just show up in economics and finance. We routinely overestimate our knowledge, skills, and abilities in many aspects of our lives. Men, myself included, suffer from overconfidence bias when we're asked for directions to go a certain place. The last thing we do is actually look at a map. Anyway, next is choice paralysis. Choice paralysis occurs when we go on cognitive overload when we're faced with too many buying options. Ever stood in the cereal aisle at the grocery store and caught yourself staring blankly at the dizzying array of options? When this happens, we either don't buy anything or we revert to what we've always done because that's the path of least resistance. And then we're disappointed with ourselves because we didn't change. Well, we didn't change because we went on cognitive overload and our brain just led us to what we've always done. Next is the endowment effect. The endowment effect occurs when we overvalue something just because we own it. I am routinely disappointed when I sell a car or a boat because I've convinced myself that it should be worth more because I was the owner. I was the steward of this asset. I've taken great care of this car, and so therefore I should get a lot more for it. Wrong. Finally, let's double-click on loss aversion. I know we talked about this last week in conjunction with the concept of the disposition effect, but I want to be sure to call it out separately. Here, we feel the sting of a loss more than we feel the joy or pleasure of experiencing a gain of exactly the same amount. So we are going to avoid losses in our investment decisions generally. So we'll be talking about and we will be referring to the tenets and impacts of cognitive bias as we continue to explore the concepts surrounding financial literacy. For now, it's important to know that we are all biased. It's a feature of the human condition that can also be a bug that negatively impacts our ability to make sound, rational decisions. We routinely make assumptions and take mental shortcuts as we make our way through each day. And to imagine that we are not biased is itself cognitive bias, a bias known as naive cynicism. Until next time, I wish you grace, dignity, and compassion in all things. My name is Andy Temte. This is the Saturday Morning Muse. You can find us on all the major streaming services as well as out on YouTube. Please like, subscribe, rate, and most importantly, share this public good with your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, and your family. The show is produced by Nicholas Temte. We'll see you next time on the Saturday Morning Muse.